Hereby called to order at 6:32. We'll take a roll call. Mr. LaFoyle? Here. Mr. Salinas?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Flores?
Present.
Mr. Salyer? We have a quorum. Presentation of budget proposed on tax rate for 2015-16 fiscal year. Dr. Matoya?
Members of the board and the public, this obviously is an event that takes place once a year to establish the tax rate for the school district, and in a sense, we do have good news. So, Mr. Elizondo.
We're gonna get this PowerPoint going here in just a second, as soon as we get the screen. All right. We're having this meeting here this evening to have a public hearing on the proposed budget and tax rate for next school year, the 15-16 school year. This is a bird's eye view of our budget. The board has, as you all know, attended a number of meetings to have budget workshops on the budget that we're going to be discussing at the meeting here in just a few minutes. And this is an opportunity for the public to view, again, in a bird's eye view, what it is that we're proposing for the budget for the next year. We prepared this budget in accordance with all the legal requirements of the Texas Education Code. The budget has to be prepared by June the 19th, which it was, and it has to be adopted for districts that have a July 1st fiscal year by June 30th. So hopefully we will be able to adopt this budget tonight, which will be well in accordance with that June 30th date. When we prepare the budget, there are a number of large factors that we look at, and the first one we look at is to see what our board goals are for the next school year to make sure that our budget is targeting those goals to accomplish them. We also always want to ensure that we're demonstrating fiscal responsibility when we're dealing with our taxpayers' dollars. Our goal is always to propose a balanced budget to the board. Obviously, if there's a surplus, that's great. There's three funds that the board always has to approve the budget for in accordance with Texas Education Code. That's the General Operating Fund, the Child Nutrition Fund, and the Interest and Sinking Fund. And we'll talk a little more about these as we go forward. How are districts funded? Basically, there are a couple of major areas that school districts are funded. The first one is through state allocations, state funding. We receive state funding both for the General Operating Fund and for the Interest and Sinking or Debt Service Fund. For this next school year, our projections for average daily attendance is 21,800 students. That's how many the kids are average number of students present during the school year. And that is a major component of how the state funds us. We also receive a lot of revenue from our local taxpayers through local tax dollars, local collections, and we're going to be looking at these a little bit into more detail in just a moment. We receive federal allocations of course, from the federal government, both in the General Operating Fund, and we'll talk about those a little bit here, and other sources as well that we get to fund our school districts. In the General Operating Fund, and this is the fund where we really take care of paying the majority of our teachers' salaries, we pay for custodians, we pay for anything that you can pretty much imagine, buying paper clips, all that comes out of the General Operating Fund. For this next school year, we're projecting in total local revenue that we're going to receive approximately $79 million. The majority of that are tax collections. In state, about $94.6 million. The federal government's going to contribute about $3.5 million based on our estimates. The majority of that is through a SHARS program. Again, that's the reimbursement program that the federal government allows us to request funds for services that we provide students with disabilities. And we have an accounting entry that we enter that we visit with you on, and it's the TRS on behalf payment. It's kind of, if you will, like the matching FICA that the government does. We don't have FICA for our employees. We have a pension plan, and the state contributes money towards that, and it's about $7.5 million a year. So our total revenue for this next year for the General Operating Fund is forecasted at approximately $184.9 or almost $185 million. In kind of graphical form for those that like to see, 51%, as you can tell from here, from our revenue is coming from the state, 43% from local funds, federal funds is about 2%, and that TRS on behalf entry is about 4%. Now, I do want to have a little caveat here. When we prepared this budget that we're presenting tonight, as well as this presentation, it was based on the old law, or current law, if you will. Now, the governor has signed the law for next school year, so these numbers are going to change a little bit. And the main change is going to be that the homestead exemption that is going to be granted, the $10,000, Right now, when we include that in here, it's not in here right now, it's gonna shift the percentage of state and local local revenue because our local taxpayers are gonna be paying less taxes in local taxes, and we'll show that in a little bit. And the state's gonna be making that up, so the percentages are gonna move a little bit. Total dollars are gonna be the same, but percentages will change, and the state will have a little bit larger percentage than it's indicating right now. On the expense side for the general operating fund, our personnel, which includes salaries and benefits, is approximately $148.7 million. Our operating expenses, which is to pay the utility bills, everything that we need in the classrooms for instructional materials, is about $28.7 million. And again, that TRS on behalf entry, the offset, a minute ago I showed you the revenue side, this is the expense side. It has to equal, it's $7.5 million. So our total expenditures that we're predicting is about $184.9 million, again, about $185 million. In graphical form, just to show you that our personnel costs for the general operating fund are going to comprise about 80% of our budget, and the operational portion is going to be 16%. That TRS portion is about 4% of the expense side of that budget. For our fund balance, again, this is based on the latest amendment, budget amendment that we have in place. It does not include one that we're going to do later tonight. So at the beginning, when we started the school year, we started with about $32.9 million of unreserved, unassigned fund balance. Our revenue projections for next year are about $185 million. Expenditures about the same. So our fund balance is going to remain pretty much unchanged at about $32.9 or $33 million. The next fund that the board has to adopt that we're going to be reviewing tonight is a child nutrition fund. This is the fund where all of our breakfast and lunches are served for our students. In total revenue, total local revenue, we receive about $2.2 million. Again, those are collections for what we charge the students and our teachers, staff to eat at our schools, whether it's breakfast or lunch. The state also provides some matching funds for the program, about $220,000 a year. And the federal government, which is the largest portion of the revenue source for this particular fund, is about $10 million. Again, this is for the free and reduced lunches that we serve and breakfast for our students. Total revenue for that fund is about $12.6 million. In graph form, percentage-wise, the federal government's picking up about 80% of the tab for that fund. Our local revenues are about 18%, and the state's doing about 2%. For the expense side of that same fund, personnel costs are about $5 million, and the operation, which is to buy food and everything else that the child nutrition program needs, is about $7.7 million. Total expenses at about $12.7 million. In graphical form, the operational side, this is just the opposite of what we saw a minute ago, where in the general operating fund, the personnel was at about 80%. Here, the personnel is about 39% for this fund, and the operations is about 61%. Again, a lot of food costs and fuel that go into this fund. Their fund balance for this fund, when we began the year, we were thinking, we started with about $3 million. When we look at the revenue and expense, we're seeing a slight decrease. Our estimated ending fund balance at the end of next school year is about $2.8 million, $2.9 million. The interest and sinking fund, which is the fund where we get to pay for the principal and interest on all the bonds that we've sold for the school district to build new facilities or renovate existing facilities. For next year, our debt service payments, what we are allowed to collect in revenue has to equal our debt service payments or pretty close to it. So for next year, we're going to look at local taxes being about $27.9 million, and the state contributes about $3.2 million with several programs that they have in place for the school district. So revenue for that fund is about $31 million for next school year. As a graphical percentage form, 90% of that revenue is being generated locally with local taxpayers' dollars, and 10% of it's coming from the state. That principal and interest payments for the debt service fund for next school year is about $31 million, and that's all we can spend out of that fund just to pay principal and interest for that debt. So those are all the expenditures that are coming out of there. 100% of that is for debt payments. The fund balance for that fund when we began the year was about $15.5 million, and our revenues and our expenses pretty much are equal. So at the end of the year, we're anticipating having a very similar fund balance. Now, there's a note at the bottom of this particular slide that tells you that even though we have that $15 million fund balance, about $9.6 million of that money is due and payable in August. So we collect the money in one fiscal year, and we pay it as soon as the next fiscal year begins. So we really need to adjust those numbers, that $15 million by that 9.6 to come to a true fund balance for those funds. When you combine all these funds together, our total local revenue is about $109.5 million. State's about $98 million. Federal about 13.6. We have that TRS on behalf again. So total revenue for this next year is about $228.6 million. If you do it in percentage-wise as total, 43% of our money is coming from the state, 48% is coming from local, and 6% is coming from the federal government, with that TRS on behalf being there at 3%. On the expense side, personnel costs for the entire program is $153.7 million. The operating budget's $36.5. Debt service, $31 million. TRS on behalf, 7.5. So total expenditures, about $228.7 or $228.8 million. If we look at it as a graphic of percentage-wise, 67% is being expended for personnel and 16% for operations. Debt service is about 14%, and again, that TRS is about 3%. If we look at the total picture again, just as one slide, total projected revenues for next year is about 228.6. Total projected expenditures about 228.7. You can see they're very close to each other. In the general operating fund, we're going to see an increase of about $28,000 to our fund balance, which really is just a break-even point. Child nutrition, a decrease of about $178.5, and interest and sinking, an increase of about $36,000. When you look at what we're projecting, just as fund balance, the total fund balance in each one of these funds, the general operating fund for the end of next school year would be around $33 million, which is about 18% of expenditures. The board has a policy that we can't go below 17%, so we're hovering right above that number. The child nutrition fund is going to have about $2.9 million, which is going to be about 23% of their expenditures. They have a maximum, just the opposite of the other, they have a maximum, not a minimum, of 25%. So they're right beneath that maximum, which is good. The interest and sinking fund is going to have about $15.6 million, which is about 50% of the expenditures. Again, once we consider that August 1st payment that we talked about, the fund balance gets reduced to about $9.6 million, which is about 19% of expenditures. Again, in the rating agencies, when they give us our credit risk for the school district, they like to see those fund balances there to show that if something happens and we're not able to collect all the taxes to pay, the principal and interest payments for that year, that we have some in reserve that we can touch to be able to make sure that we pay those payments. On the tax rate for next school year, to be able to fund this particular budget, we're looking at two different components of the tax rate. The maintenance and operation rate, which is $1.04 per hundred. We're proposing to leave that unchanged at that rate. And the debt service rate, and for that particular rate, we're proposing to drop it by half a penny. So instead of being 0.385, it would be 0.38. Our total tax rate for next year would be $1.42 per hundred. On this particular slide, what we're trying to do is just kind of show the effects of our tax rates on the homeowner. We have three different columns. One of them shows you a property that's worth $90,000. There's a homestead exemption that's allowed if it's your personal home that you're living in or buying, and that exemption is $15,000 that we grant to all of our taxpayers. So the taxable value is $75,000. So based on that $1.42 we talked about, the taxes for this next year would be $1,065 for the year for that individual owning a house at that value. This past year, it was $1,068, so pretty much the same amount. That next number below that, the $923, with that additional $10,000 increase in the homestead exemption. Now, I put an asterisk there because it is pending voter approval in the November general election, but we're thinking it's going to pass. It would be $923 is what the taxpayer would pay versus $1,065 with that new exemption. Now that difference in money that we're losing is going to become, the state's going to make that up. So they'll give us whatever it is that we lose, they're going to make up dollar for dollar. So they're telling us, we'll see. There's another example there, that middle column of $134,373. That is the average home in Judson ISD. If we take them all, average them together, that's what it costs. So you can see that individual that owns an average valued property in Judson would be paying about $1,695 without that additional homestead exemption, and with it, it would be about $1,553. The difference for anybody who owns a residential property who is a homestead and eligible for the homestead exemption, because it's $10,000, it's $142 savings per year. So it doesn't really matter what your value of your house is. It's going to be $142 that you will be saving on your annually on your home because of that new $10,000 homestead exemption that should be passed in November. And that's all I have for this particular part of the presentation. If anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to try to address them.
Thank you. Is there any board questions? Any questions on anything? Nothing? Anyone? Nothing? Okay, well, nothing? Yeah, public, yeah. Any public questions? It's a public hearing. No? Okay. This public hearing is, this public hearing is closed at 6:47. Okay, let's go in our special meeting. Okay. This special meeting of Judson Board of Trustees is hereby called to order.